Sarai Mitnick, and this is Seamwork Radio, where we tell stories about the surprising ways that sewing impacts our lives. Welcome back to Seamwork Radio, where we share practical ideas for building a creative process so you can sew with intention and joy. Today, we're talking about how you can teach someone else in your life how to sew. And this topic was inspired by our new course, which is called Learn to Sew Clothing for Absolute Beginners. And Haley and I teach this course. And we've been working on it a lot. So we've been thinking a lot about what's the best way to teach someone else how to sew. And we wanted to share that with you today. So this is going to be helpful to you if you're a beginner yourself, if you're more experienced and you might want to share those skills with other people, or even if you're learning a totally different skill or hobby and you want some practical tips to help keep you motivated. So we're going to cover how to choose their first project, how to help them choose fabric for the first time, and how to support them as they continue their sewing journey. So we're going to start off with our icebreaker for today, and that comes from Megan. And Megan asks, what did you study in school? Is your career in sewing/clothing what you envisioned for yourself when you were in high school/college? If not, what steps led you down this path? All right, Haley, you can start us off.
I, in fact, I studied fashion design in college. It was a really comprehensive program. I did a lot of pattern making and sewing, so it wasn't just all mood boards and sketching and that kind of thing. I have my BFA in fashion design, and I had the intention of having a career in ready-to-wear, and I did. That is where I started my career, but I really did not like it. And while I had my first job in the industry post-school, I took an interview at a small fabric store, and I just fell in love. That was the first time I saw a Colette pattern. And and if you're not familiar with Colette, that is the predecessor of Seamwork.
Mm-hmm.
And I just fell in love. I was like, this is so cool. It was kind of a whole new world. I wasn't introduced to sewing by the home sewing industry. It was like in a professional setting that I learned it. So it just kind of opened my eyes, and it introduced me to one of my life's biggest passions, which is teaching people how to sew, and also just mentorship in general. Yeah, and that's how I landed here. That is the very abridged version of it. I did not imagine myself in the home sewing industry, but that is more from a lack of knowing of its existence in a way, not because I was looking down my nose at it or anything like that. I just didn't really know it existed. I was like, yeah, there's vintage patterns at the thrift store when I go thrifting, but I never gave it too much thought beyond that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's how I landed here. What about you, Sarai?
Well, in school, I studied something completely unrelated. At least when I was an undergrad, I studied religious studies. And the reason I chose religious studies is it was just something that I was really interested in, and I'm still very interested in. I'm really interested in the history of religion and the sort of anthropological aspects of religion, and also sort of the philosophical parts of it. So I chose that only because it was something I was interested in, and the advice I was kind of given going into college was that if you decide to have a liberal arts degree, nearly any subject you study, you're going to learn skills that are going to be transferable, how to write well, how to communicate, and things like that. So that's what I studied as an undergrad. And then after I graduated from college and I worked for a few years, I decided to go back to school, and I went to grad school, and I went to the UC Berkeley School of Information, which used to be the library science department. And basically what I studied was human-computer interaction. So basically how people interact with technology. And I worked in that field after grad school in the tech industry. And so it was pretty different from the sewing world, but I've been sewing since I was in high school. So since I was about 16 is when I first learned to sew my first garment. And I'd been doing little hand sewing projects and things like that, and embroidery and things ever since I was a little kid. And it's always been something that I just loved. I love clothing. I've just always been really interested in fashion and clothing and visual arts of all kinds. But I was really not encouraged to pursue that as a career. And I think once I was in the working world for a little while, I realized that I wanted to do something that was more creative and more, I don't know, just I guess more impactful in a way. I wanted to kind of bring that creativity to other people. And I was just really kind of floored by how difficult it is to learn how to sew. And a lot of people learn how to sew just by picking up a pattern at a place like Joann or Walmart. I don't know if Walmart still sells patterns, but at the time. And they weren't really made for people who didn't know what they were doing yet. They were made for people who had been sewing for a long time. And so it's daunting. So I really wanted to create a different kind of sewing pattern, something that would have really clear step by step directions that would explain all the terms, walk you through it, and make the process a lot more approachable. So it was sort of a new product idea. And I started with that. I started to collect patterns, which you mentioned, Haley. And then it morphed into what it is today. I never really thought it would be as a 10-person company, about what we are right now, and have this amazing, amazing global community attached to it. So it's not at all what I envisioned, to answer Megan's question in any way. Like there was no grand vision for any of this until, maybe the last few years. So it's really interesting to think about, actually.
Yeah, I think we could do a whole episode on like the evolution of seamwork. Maybe someday we should.
Yeah.
I think it's an interesting story.
I think it is, but it happened to me, so I'm biased. And I shouldn't say there was no grand vision, actually. I mean, but my vision was much smaller in the beginning. I really wanted to have a career that was creative and fun, and that I would have, good work-life balance, and it definitely grow from there.
Yeah, I think you're underselling it a little bit, because we've worked together for 7 years now, and you've always had a vision. It's just evolved, and that's, I think, the way that a vision should work. It should evolve as you evolve, as the world evolves.
Yeah.
So yeah.
It's true. And a lot of the things that I valued then, I still really value. I still think work-life balance is incredibly important for me and for everybody else that works with us. I still think that creativity and having fun with what you do is really, really important. So I feel like the values and the purpose are the same, but the actual form it takes has definitely changed over the years. Wow. Thank you, Megan. I didn't expect such a long-winded answer, probably, but that's kind of how things have gone for the two of us. If you have an icebreaker that you want us to use on a future episode, you can leave it for us on the Seamwork community. If you're a member, just go to seamwork.com/go/icebreakers, and that'll take you to a thread on the community where you can post yours, and we'll probably use it in the future. So thanks again, Megan. All right, so getting into our topic for today, which is teaching someone else how to sew, or maybe if you're a beginner, teaching yourself how to sew. I wanted to talk about, what happens when I meet somebody and they find out that I sew, or they find out that I have a sewing related business. So I find that one of two things happens. Either one, they tell me about the sewing machine that they have, like probably stuck in a closet somewhere, and they have no clue how to use it. They don't know how to thread it. They always tell me that. Or they ask me to hem their jeans. And what I kind of wanted to address was the first case. People who have a sewing machine, they maybe had an idea that they wanted to sew, or maybe they've made like some simple things, pillows or curtains or something, and they just don't know how to get beyond that point. They are intimidated by threading it, or they're intimidated by using it. And how do you help somebody like that? So if you sew, you've probably encountered people like that, and maybe you've wished you could help them out a little bit. So that's what we're going to talk about today. I think a lot of us learned from a friend, or we learned from a family member, not all of us, but a lot of us. And you might want to pass that skill along too. I think it's also a really great way to bond with people that you love and make a real difference in their life by teaching them this really valuable skill that they can use for the rest of their life. And if they get really into sewing, if it's something that resonates with them, then, it might make a really big difference to them psychologically. It might change their perspective on the world, on their body, on the things that they buy. As we all know, sewing can have all of these impacts, and you never know who's going to be really impacted by it. So it can be a real gift. But on the other hand, teaching someone else how to sew probably sounds kind of intimidating because it is such a complex skill and there are so many parts involved and it does take a while to learn. So all of that makes it feel a little bit intimidating, getting beyond kind of that first initial point of using the sewing machine. So that's what we wanted to talk about today and give you some practical tips that'll help you get over that hump. So, Haley, as somebody who has taught sewing professionally, how many people do you think you've taught to sew?
Well, through in-person classes, definitely hundreds. I
Mhm.
would say maybe in the range of, I've probably had at least in the ballpark of 500 students, in-person students. But then through the work I've done in more recent years in online teaching, it's kind of hard to say. I've taught a lot of people how to sew, though.
Mhm. Yeah, same. I have no idea how many, but I feel like it's a whole lot because well, I wrote a
Uh-huh.
sewing book that was really geared towards people learning, beginners and advanced beginners. So I tens of thousands of people bought that book. So I don't know how many of them were learning to sew or learned to sew from it, but that makes me really proud. I'm really happy that I put that out into the world. I think that goes back to just the I don't know, the joy of knowing that you're bringing this skill to other people when it's something that's meant a lot to you.
Yeah, definitely. Even still, sometimes we'll get like a comment on a YouTube video or a response to an email or something, and they're like, "Oh, it's Haley. She taught me how to sew and back in 2011 or something." And that always makes me really happy. When I lived in LA still, which is where I taught sewing, I would see people in the grocery store. They'd give me like this big smile and be like, "Hi, how are you doing?" And I always felt really bad. You can't like remember like every single name and face of someone you like taught one class to.
Yeah.
And so I was always just like, "Hi, how's sewing going?" Just you just kind of like roll with it. I
Yeah.
imagine that's how like teachers feel too,
Mhm.
school teachers. They're like,
Yeah.
right? I think
"Hey,
maybe there's
you?"
teachers out there that can confirm. Maybe it's probably different when you spend a year with them, but I imagine there's some people who are less memorable. I don't know. That's a whole other tangent. Well, Sari, who taught you how to sew and what was that experience like?
I learned to sew. I learned kind of the basics of sewing from my grandmother. She taught me how to use a sewing machine and kind of how to thread it, how to use a sewing pattern, all the sort of basic things. And we made our first garment together, which she did most of the sewing on, to be honest. And then from then on, I kind of taught myself. I learned on my own. This is before YouTube, obviously, and a lot of the resources that we have out there today. So I kind of picked it up from sewing patterns. Like I said, a lot of people learn from sewing patterns, and I definitely learned a lot from sewing patterns. Probably took me a lot longer than it would have otherwise if I'd had a little bit more direct instruction and books and just trying things out. It was really a trial and error
Mhm.
process for many, many years, which is it's good and bad. I think it has its advantages. But my grandmother did teach me the things you really need to know, like how to use a sewing machine, how to stitch without pulling on the fabric, how to thread the machine, how to install a facing, do all the things that you really need to know in order to get started. What about you? Who taught you?
Well, my first sewing teacher, I learned pattern making and sewing in tandem, which I actually do not recommend. It was like just really confusing to draft things that I had never made with my hands. And then it's just kind of like working backwards. It didn't make a lot of sense to my brain in particular. So, a woman named Vera Bruce was my first instructor in pattern making and sewing. And she was the lead pattern maker for Jordache jeans for a number of years. She was very hardcore, like perfectionist. She was like a tough teacher, but like really cool lady. But the thing about it is that she would show you something once and like that was it. You had to like remember. And this is before, I mean, I think YouTube maybe was in early days, but there wasn't like, it was not what it is now. You watched like Charlie bit my finger videos kind of thing on YouTube back then. Anyway, so I had my two girlfriends, Adri and Rachel, who I was going to school with, and they had sewing knowledge. They had been sewing for a number of years. And so they were like my mentors every time I was like, wait, how do you understitch again? What's understitching? They they would
Yeah.
break it down for me and kind of tutor me a little bit. And those are kind of like the three most influential people in my early sewing days. And Rachel and Adri I still talk to on a weekly basis. They're my OG sewing friends.
I think it just goes to show how important it is to have somebody kind of at your back when you're first starting out, and somebody you can go to, or community
Yes.
you can go to, group of people you can go to whenever you have questions, because it's pretty easy to get lost, and then when you get lost you can get really demotivated. So I think having that,
Mm-hmm.
and if you can be that for somebody else, it's a really nice gift that you can give someone. Is there anything that you wish you had learned up front when you were learning how to sew?
Well, like I mentioned earlier, I learned how to pattern make and to sew simultaneously, and that was really challenging. I felt like I was trying to draft things that I had never sewn and, obviously sewing things I had never, seen examples of.
Mhm.
So I wish that I had worked with more commercial patterns up front. I think that would have been really helpful. And it also just kind of like taught me a lesson about learning in general, that sometimes the kind of like slow and steady approach is ends up yielding a lot better results, because I think it took me a lot longer to catch on to certain things because I was just
Mhm.
overloaded with information. That's kind of my like, not regret, because I learned a lot from it, but the thing I definitely wish I had learned up front and I implemented as a teacher. What about you, Sari?
Well, I think a lot of people go through that feeling of just being overwhelmed by how much there is to learn and really not knowing
Mm-hmm.
what you don't know when you're learning something new. And I think that was true for me as well. One thing that sticks out in my mind is finishing. I feel like it took me a really long time to understand how to finish garments so that they held up over time and they looked professional and they looked really nice on the inside as well as the outside, because that always gave me that feeling that, the what I had made was not quite up to snuff, because it didn't look like a garment you could buy in a store, for example, or even, a vintage homemade garment that was well made. So it took me a
Mm-hmm.
really long time to kind of figure that out, and I wish I had just learned about some of those options for finishing garments without a serger a little earlier on. And, not just finishing, but a lot of those kinds of little details that make something just look finished and polished and make you feel that sense of pride in the garment you made. It doesn't look
Mm-hmm.
so, I don't want to say homemade, but more just not quite as finished and not quite as durable as it could be.
Yeah.
So, we've talked a lot about the experience of learning how to sew, and we have some tips for you today that Haley's going to share from her many years teaching sewing. So, if you are somebody who wants to either learn how to sew or get better at sewing, if you're a beginner, or if you're somebody who is ready to show somebody else how to sew, or you think that's something you might want to do in the future, Haley's going to share some tips with you.
Yes. So, like Sari said, this is definitely inspired from my years of teaching experience, but also from our more recent experience of creating the Learn to Sew for Absolute Beginners. And so, this is like a little taste of some of the framework that is applied in that class. So, I'm going to jump right in. So, the first thing that I always recommend starting off with is a rectangle. And you're like, what? That's boring. What do you mean a rectangle? What I mean by rectangle is so a tote bag, so a pillowcase, so a tea towel, things that are, in fact, square or rectangular. I think that when people want to learn how to sew clothing, they want to, like, obviously jump in and make a garment, and that's all good and great. But as we all know, sewing garments comes with its own set of challenges. And I think that people, when they experience that first taste of sewing success, they are way more likely to be stoked about sewing and come back for more. And something that you don't have to put on your body, something that you get to use every day or look at every day, is going to give them that immediate sense of pride and give them, you want them to get bit by the sewing bug. So sew a rectangle with them. I think that is such a great first step. It's going to develop that muscle memory. It's going to help them to get comfortable with their machine and their tools. And I think that that's something that I know for a fact, they're going to feel really proud of. So that is step number one.
Yeah,
Make a rectangle.
I think that those kinds of projects are really undervalued because it seems kind of boring to sew a tote bag or to sew a pillowcase, but those are things that you can actually use all the time. And if you make it in a cool fabric, then it can be really exciting and really, I don't know, build your pride and your confidence early on.
Yeah, and in making that rectangle, they're going to be learning some really vital skills like how to create a seam, how to finish a seam, how to press a seam. There's probably
Mhm.
going to be a little bit of hemming. And so when they move on to a garment, there are going to be component skills that they are already familiar with. And when I say component skills, those are like the little tiny component skills that make up the larger active sewing. So, like,
Mhm.
a straight seam, darts, hems, all of that kind of stuff. Next, we're going to recommend making some kind of pull on or pull over garment. For this project, I recommend sticking to wovens. I think that woven fabrics are just a little more predictable, a little bit easier for beginners to work with.
Mhm.
And if it's a pull on or pull over, then we're going to be avoiding closures, which can be a little bit more finicky and challenging for beginners. Another thing that I tend to avoid for this second project is anything that has bias tape. I think that that requires a little bit of precision that most beginners have not quite mastered yet. Again, you're trying to set them up for success here. You want them to feel really confident and really proud of what they're making. So, kind of like avoiding those kind of pitfalls or trouble spots for these first couple projects, I think really goes a long way for creating that confidence.
Mhm.
Something that I like to do here is give them a few options of what they can make. It can feel when you're a beginner, it's frustrating. You have a million ideas what you want to make, and everyone's telling you to make pajama pants. And you're like, I don't want to make pajama pants. I want to make like these trousers of my dreams or something. So give them a few options to choose from so they can feel like they have some creative control over their project at this point. Two seam work patterns that I think are really great would be Hanzi, which is a pullover woven tee, and Madu, which is also a pull-on woven tee, but it has a more peasant top design with a lot of elastic and things like that.
Yeah, I just made a module. Well, I turned it into a dress, but it's very easy to sew. It's very simple.
Yeah, it's a really fun pattern. I mean, I think that it's really one of those ones that if they choose that, I would make it along with them because it's fun for you too. It's nice to revisit some of those simpler projects, I think. I
Mhm.
love a quick and easy project for my own self-confidence from time to time. Kind of going along with tip number 2, which is to pick that pullover garment, it can be really helpful to pick out a few of the challenging component skills that you are going to be covering in that garment and make some little muslin samples of them. So, for example, Malu has some curved seams when you're sewing the facing to the neckline, and you're also doing some elastic casings. So, giving them a chance to practice sewing some curved seams, giving them a chance to practice creating a little elastic casing. This doesn't have to be anything big. They don't need to make a whole muslin mock-up of the project. It could be as simple as, creating a casing using a 10 by 10 square of muslin and a small length of elastic. And I think that this builds some confidence because it allows them to practice a skill in a no pressure way. They don't have to wear this when they're done with it. They can throw it in the trash for all I care. But they get the benefit of having the experience before they're sewing with their, fashion fabric, things like that. And I think this can be really helpful to just take that hour before you jump into that first garment and practice some of those component skills. The next thing that I recommend doing with them is to take them fabric shopping. Fabric shopping in the fabric store is super overwhelming for beginners. I say this from my experience teaching, my experience as a beginner personally, and also as someone who's worked in a fabric store before. People walk into those doors and they're like a deer in the headlights. It's really overwhelming, and it's a little bit of a different shopping process than a lot of things. So showing them around a fabric store, showing them where they can find the things that they need to find, giving them a little bit of insight on some terminology, that's really helpful. But also just the process of picking your fabric, bringing it up to the counter to be cut, in some cases, bringing it to an entirely separate counter to be rung up. This is just a little bit different for people. And I think that it makes people feel a lot more confident if they've been able to do this at least one time with a friend.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I remember shopping for my first project with my grandmother, and we went to a Joann store, and it was so big and there were so many options, and I had no idea what I was looking for. And she really helped me to pick out that first fabric and make sure that it was appropriate for the garment, because I would have had no idea, and I probably would have chosen something that was absolutely the wrong fabric for what we were making, which was a pullover dress. And I think just having that guidance from someone is so helpful.
Yeah, I agree. I remember going to the fabric store my very first time, and I went alone, and I was just so terrified. I'm like, what do I do? I think I ended up going up to someone who was shopping for fabric that looked like they knew what they were doing. And I'm like, hi, how do I do this? And they were obviously nice enough to help. And I've actually been that person. Even recently, I was at a Joann and someone came up to me. It was during Halloween when, everybody who doesn't know how to sew goes to a fabric store. And she's like, what am I doing? Where do I go? I was like, I got you. I think that's such a great thing to give someone an experience with. So to recap where we're at, you're helping them sew their first garment, but along with that, you're helping them tackle some of those component skills in advance and helping them shop for fabric in advance. And then you make your project together. That's very exciting. Hopefully they're feeling really good, really proud about what they make. From there, I recommend that they go home and they try to make that project again with another fabric without your help. I think repetition is super, super helpful, and also having the benefit of having a little bit of repetition, but without the reinforcement of you there to help them. This is, I think, really crucial and helps them build a little bit of confidence of sewing outside of your supervision, because that's obviously the end goal, is for them to have a little bit of independence, or a lot of bit of independence with their sewing.
Mm-hmm.
From there, I think it is kind of a matter of giving them some great recommendations and guidance and kind of inducting them into your sewing circle. So recommend some patterns for them to sew. I recommend things that are mostly skills that they've already, those component skills, once again, that they've already used in their previous 2 projects, but then a couple new skills. Maybe they're ready to do some bias tape. Maybe they want to tackle a buttonhole or a button. So recommend some other projects that will give them more confidence in the skills they already have, and then allow them to explore some other skills. I'd also recommend some resources for them. There's a ton of great online resources, and this is where I'm going to shamelessly plug Seamwork. They can join Seamwork and they can get a whole bunch of patterns as a Seamwork member, and also the sew along classes. If they're not ready to make that small investment yet, then they can subscribe to our YouTube channel which is totally free, and there's a ton of resources there. And if they want to just go like all in and they're like, yes, I want to invest in this hobby, I'm really into it, then we have our brand new course, Learn to Sew for Absolute Beginners, which is going to take them through a whole bunch of beginner component skills and also walk them through sewing two garments, the Quince day robe and the Georgia dress. And we really help them to bring all of those component skills together in a way that works for people who have the ultimate goal of sewing their own clothing.
Mhm.
And of course, books, any books that you like, you can recommend to them. I do think it's nice to have some sewing resource books.
Yeah, I think it's good to have at least one reference book when you're a beginner.
Yeah, definitely. It's because it's overwhelming. You go to like Google how to install a zipper, and there's like a million different things that come up. It's nice to have like one tried and true place that you look to.
Mhm.
And then kind of my last step is you don't want to be their only, you don't want to be their only sewing friend. You want to invite them into this amazing community that we have. So invite them to sew with you. Invite them next time you go to the fabric store, schedule sewing dates, maybe go take a sewing class together, start a sewing circle. Just really warmly welcome them into the community because aside from sewing just being awesome in general and a great creative hobby, I think that our community is so warm and such a great place, and also just a tremendous resource for people who are starting out on their sewing journey.
Yeah, I think that's so important. I think just having that sense of community and a place where you can turn to is going to help inspire confidence as you continue to learn. All right. Well, I'm going to recap all these tips. This is really kind of a step-by-step process that you can follow, whether you are yourself learning how to sew or if you are teaching somebody else. I think if you're somebody who wants to learn how to sew or you're kind of in the beginning stages and you have somebody who is willing to help you, this is a great framework that you could bring to them and say, this is what I want to do. I want to, start with a rectangle, move on through the garment. I want to try it on my own afterwards. And you have a framework, and that takes the pressure off of them to figure out how to teach you. And you can kind of make it a little bit easier on your teacher, your volunteer teacher. All right. So I'm just going to recap the steps for you. So the first step is to start with a rectangle, like a tote bag or a pillowcase, something that will just be very easy, but will help you to kind of get comfortable with your machine. And then number 2 is for the first garment, choose a pull-on garment or a pullover garment, something that's made with a woven fabric and that doesn't have any kind of closures or bias tape. And if you're somebody who is teaching somebody else, you might want to pick out a few different options and let them choose so that they have that sense of creativity and pride that goes with making their first garment. And then after that, pick out a few challenging component skills and give them an opportunity to practice those before they sew the garment. So take some of those small skills they'll use in this first project and have them practice those with some scrap fabric so that they kind of feel a little bit more confident when they get to the actual garment. Number 4 is to take them fabric shopping. And again, try to pick out some options that they can choose from so you can make it a little bit less intimidating for them. And then have them repeat the project without you after you've sewn it together. So sew it together the first time, and then the second time have them go home and sew it without you so that they can learn how to do it more independently. Recommend patterns that they can sew after that first garment so that they know where to go from there. Give them some resources so that they have a place to turn and learn when they need to other than you. So, of course, Seamwork is a great place, or a YouTube channel. Books are also wonderful. And of course, we have our brand new class that is really a step-by-step process for learning how to sew. And next, and the last tip is invite them to sew with you so that you have some time together to both socialize and also give them an opportunity to have somebody to bounce ideas off of and learn from on an ongoing basis. And it's just fun that way. Sewing can be a little bit isolating. It is a very solitary activity most of the time, but we can make it more of a community activity, which I think is really, really fun. So those are our tips. My big takeaway from this episode is really that having a community around you, whether that's one person or a whole bunch of people, whether that's in person or it's online, is really valuable when you're just starting out because, again, you don't know what you don't know. And having people around you that can support you and answer questions as they come up is probably the number one thing that's going to help both motivate you and teach you how to do a complex skill like sewing much faster. What's your big takeaway, Haley?
Oh my gosh, so many big takeaways. I would say that my biggest takeaway is that setting a person who's beginning their sewing journey up for success with small victories along the way is really going to be a huge key to making sure that sewing is something that sticks for them. So really just like fostering this place where they can really succeed.
Yeah, definitely. And if you want to learn more about sewing clothing, so if you are somebody who's new and you want to learn how to do this and you don't have a person near you who can teach you in person, you might want to check out our new course. It's called Learn to Sew Clothing for Absolute Beginners, and it really is for true beginners. If you're new to sewing and you want to learn everything you need to know as a beginner, we go through all of those component skills. We have you practice them, and then we make some projects together. Haley and I teach this course. We've spent a long time designing this course and making it as helpful as we possibly can for people who are new to sewing. So whether you are someone who is interested in learning yourself, or if you know somebody who's interested in learning, that's a great place to send them. So you can find that on our website at seamwork.com. And I also want to mention our YouTube channel, since Haley mentioned it earlier. We have a YouTube channel with a lot of videos. We're always putting out new videos. We put out a new video every week, and you can follow us there for new free sewing videos. So we have a huge library there. It's over 200 videos right now, and it's always growing. And you'll also see some peeks behind the scenes at Seamwork, and lots of great conversations like you hear on the podcast also happen over on our YouTube channel. So you can find that at youtube.com/c/Seamwork Video, or you can just look for our channel called Seamwork Video on YouTube. And I hope you join us there because we're having a lot of fun creating YouTube videos right now. We're trying a lot of different types of videos right now, and we're having a really, really good time with YouTube. So you can join the community over there as well. And if you liked this episode, please leave us a review. We really, really appreciate it and helps other people to find the podcast. Here's a review from Afraz99, left a review saying, I've been a Seamwork member for a while, but just started listening. My sewing is pretty chaotic and messy at times, and their advice helps me to stay streamlined enough to enjoy the creativity of sewing. The podcast is motivating and calming at the same time. Oh, thank you so much. That's awesome to hear. I know sewing can sometimes be a little chaotic, and it can be helpful to have a little bit more structure added to it. So thank you so much. That's really great to hear. And we'd love to hear from you. So if you would like to leave a review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify or wherever you listen, we would love to hear it. You can also, again, follow us on YouTube at Seamwork Video, like I mentioned. You can follow us on Instagram at Seamwork. And if you'd like to join Seamwork and become part of our private community, plus get access to hundreds of sewing patterns and dozens of sew-along classes, our podcast listeners get a 50% off lifetime discount when you join at seamwork.com/go/podcast50. So that's seamwork.com/go/podcast50. All right, and that does it for today. I'm Sarai.
And I'm Haley.
And this is Seamwork Radio. Seamwork Radio is brought to you by the Seamwork community, and you can find us at seamwork.com. If you have a story to share, send us an email at podcast@seamwork.com. We'd especially love to hear stories from those whose experiences often get left out of the conversation, whether because of race, gender identity, sexual orientation, disability, age, or any other reason. Again, that's podcast@seamwork.com. You can find us on Instagram at Seamwork and Seamwork Video on YouTube. We'd love to invite you to join us at seamwork.com. We have an amazing community there, as well as new sewing patterns and classes each month for members. Podcast listeners can get 50% off our unlimited membership, which gets you unlimited downloads from our library of over 150 wardrobe-building sewing patterns. Just visit seamwork.com/go/podcast50. You can also find that link in the show notes. And if you like this podcast, please consider giving us a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts or the podcast app of your choice. It really helps other people to find the show so they can hear these stories too. Thanks for joining us, and we'll be back with you soon. I'm Sarai Mitnick, and this is Seamwork Radio.